We are looping it back today and talking about engaging community feedback. Again, thank you so much for joining. You really could have been anywhere doing anything, but you have chosen to spend your this 45 minutes with us today. And so we're going to dive heavy into the content, and then we'll leave the last 15 minutes to make up 1 hour for any questions that you all may have. Now, I do want to say this. We have a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It should be at the bottom of your toolbar in Zoom. And so feel free to use that question feature. If there are any questions that you have, you most certainly can also add those questions to the chat. We have some team members who will be able to pull those and make sure that we elevate them at the end of our time today. All right, well, welcome again. My name is Sharina Bates. I'm the project director at Collaborative Innovation Studio at Digital Promise, and I am going to be your facilitator for today. On the screen, you see the agenda. We are headed somewhere today. We're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about diagnosis to system. So moving from a diagnosis to a system. We're also going to talk about who's missing from the room. Thinking about as we're getting feedback and interpreting that feedback, is there a group missing that we should be elevating their voice? And then we're going to take a look at loops in practice. So what does a feedback loop look like real time? We're going to look at a case study that I think will be very exciting and appetizing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about our Summer School 2026 and of course our Q&A and close out. But before we do all of that, let me tell you about Digital Promise. We are a global nonprofit, and for us, that's not just a title. It really is a commitment. Our purpose is to expand opportunity for every learner, and we really do pursue that by walking side by side with educators, with researchers, communities, students, and entrepreneurs, ed tech developers, and solution providers like yourselves. And so our approach is different. We do this work with communities. We co-design, we co-create, we co-invest in innovations that truly reflect the lived realities of those we aim to support. And the Collaborative Innovation Studio is Digital Promises initiative really focused on specifically co-design and co-research between ed tech developers and the districts and students that they serve. And so that's the work that we're here to talk about today. So without further ado, just before we dive in, on the screen, you see some amazing folks. This is the brain power behind the Collaborative Innovation Studio. So salute to all of these amazing folks on screen for just doing the work that they do every day. All right, so let's go on our journey. We're going to connect today. We looked at root causes last week. I'm going to bring a little bit of that in to make the connection between the systems work that we're going to talk about in feedback loops. And then we're going to look at how to identify and structure a feedback loop from start to finish. And then lastly, we're going to look at a 4-step process on how to apply input from your stakeholders in real scenarios, okay? And in order to make real shifts. So I want to hear from you. If you would please, we have a poll that we are going to launch. Let's take a look at this question. Where does most of your product feedback come from right now? I want you to think about that. Right now on your team, is it from direct conversations with educators and students? Is it maybe from usage data and analytics? Is it from internal team judgment, maybe recommendations from within your own team? Or is it a mix, but nothing formal? Let's take about 60 seconds to react to this poll. Where does most of your product feedback come from right now? And I think 30 more seconds. Give everyone an opportunity to respond. All right, can we share our results? Let's see. Okay, looks like we have a little bit from direct conversations with educators and students. some usage data and analytics, the same for internal judgment, and then a mix, but nothing formal. All of that is very good. All of that is very good. Thank you for sharing that. I want us to put a pin in that because as we get closer to the end, I'm going to ask you a question. So I want you to put a pin in those responses. So let's take a look now at looping it back. I want to set the stage to talk about how collaborative innovation really creates this opportunity for genuine feedback. I mentioned earlier that in the studio, we do work with educators, with solution providers, ed tech developers, and we do that anchored in 6 tenets. And so I'm not going to read all of these tenets to you. You can certainly reference our website to get some more information. But I will share with you that these core tenets, collaborative ownership, context expertise, reimagining progress, building capacity, continuity of commitment, and then student voice, that these are not, aspirational values. They really are our operating principles behind how we believe feedback should work. And so when you see things like collective ownership, that means that people giving you feedback shouldn't just be sources of data, but they really should have an investment, some skin in the game. The same is true for continuity of commitment, meaning that feedback isn't just for a moment, but it really is built on the foundation of a relationship. And so keep that in mind as we talk about feedback and co-design. So not last week, it was the week before, we had our webinar one. We talked a lot about co-design to frame up the way that we do collaborative innovation and engage with districts, educators, ed tech developers. And so I want to reframe that for us today to make that connective tissue. Co-design is the process where we come together across our stakeholder groups to solve a shared problem through collaborative research and development. And so I want to be specific about what that means for ed tech developers, solution providers, entrepreneurs, because we may hear the word co-design and think, it means just letting users give us feature requests. But in reality, for us, co-design means that people who are most affected by your solution are in the room when decisions are being made. So not user testing, not just at the launch, but really helping to define the problem itself. And so in co-design, we have 3 priorities, and I'll share those really, really briefly. These are the things that make co-design real. The first is prioritizing relationships. When you think about prioritizing relationships, you think about trust building and meaningful relationships that are based on things like respect in hopes of identifying a shared solution to a problem. The second priority is about capacity building. And in co-design, it really champions this idea that everyone has something to teach and everyone has something to learn. And then the last priority that we really focus on is shared contribution and benefit. And so the sharing of the workload, the contributions, and ensuring that everyone's ideas and perspectives are really considered thoughtfully throughout the entire process is what we believe shared contribution and benefit holds. And in practice, this looks like a few different things. The first is that districts lead the way, right? They surface real challenges and real priorities that they have. And so instead of maybe validating a roadmap, they're really naming what it is that they need. Another way that this shows up in practice is providers make adaptations. You make adjustments to the tool or the platform or the product in direct response to what it is that the district surfaced. And you're building functionality that works in practice, not just in theory. And then lastly, this looks like students, families, and educators making contributions. So their perspectives are grounded in the decisions because they are closest to the challenge, right? Their lived experience, their context, and content expertise is really prioritized in the process. And so co-design really helps to shape the continuity between the problem and the solution. And again, I want to remind you, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat. I promise you that we will get to them. And so let's take a look at defining feedback loops. We're going to look at moving from diagnosis to system. Before we dive into that framework, I have a reflection prompt on screen, something I want you to think about. Think of a time when you were asked to give feedback, maybe on a project, on a product, on a process, maybe at your organization. Maybe you were a part of a community group. But I want you to respond in the chat. When you were asked to give feedback, what was your experience? And why is it that you felt that way? So, did you feel seen, valued, and heard? Maybe you felt like the ask was just an afterthought. Or maybe you even felt like it was just done out of compliance. Drop that in the chat. Think back to a time when you were asked to give feedback. What was your experience? And let me see if I can. And I don't see any, I hope that it may be that I'm not able to see it. So, oh, I see you, Danny. There we go. For the moment that felt like it was done out of compliance. Decisions had already been made. And what I got in response to my feedback was pushback and an argument. Thank you so much for that transparency and vulnerability. Thank you for sharing that, Danny. And that happens often. That happens often, whether it's, in a workplace, in a personal setting. Sometimes it's done just to check a box to say, well, I asked, right? But there wasn't any intentionality behind it. So I appreciate you naming that. I see you, Kellyanne, felt heard, seen, and valued. Thank you for sharing that. And so I want you to, again, put a pin in that from that poll response, where it is that most of your feedback is coming from. And then when you were asked about feedback, I asked, but your answer was wrong. Yeah, that happens. That absolutely happens. I want you to put a pin in both of those because I mentioned earlier, we're going to come back to that a little bit later. Thank you so much for sharing your feedback. All right, so really quickly, I mentioned in webinar one, we talked about co-design, and a part of that was identifying a framework around the five whys analysis. And so if you're not familiar, the five whys is where you name a challenge or a problem, and you ask why five times. And when you arrive at that fifth why, generally that is the root of the matter, right? And so we don't ever want to focus our resources, our time, our investment on addressing a symptom, but we really want to get to the root of the problem. And the five whys analysis is absolutely good. However, it is a one-time tool, a one-time deep look at why a solution maybe isn't gaining any traction. It's a quick snapshot of the root cause. But in a feedback loop, that is different. The feedback loop really is what makes the snapshot reoccurring and actionable because it's a system that keeps closing the gap over time. It's iterative, right? It's not just a one time, but it is continuous. And I will say that both matter, right? You always want to get to the root of it, but you don't ever want to just stay there. You want to constantly be iterating to address the needs. And so that is what the feedback loop builds over time. And so here is where collaborative innovation, co-design meets real-time learning and responsiveness. What makes it a feedback loop? On the screen, you'll see that feedback loop is that active process for improving a product or a tool, and doing so by collecting and reacting to users' comments or their feedback. And so a feedback loop is always going to have these three indicators. The first one is that it's going to be tied to something specific. And so if it's out there willy-nilly, that maybe is not a feedback loop. You want it to be tied to something specific. It's connected to a real decision or challenge. The second is that information is going to flow both ways. And so when your community stakeholders give their input or give their feedback, it's shared back to them, right? Because they want to know that what it is that they gave input on was being considered thoughtfully. And then it's iterative. So I mentioned that it's a cycle, that it's continuous. And you may have heard this term continuous improvement. That is going to happen within the feedback loop because you're constantly wanting to make improvements. Now, here are three things that I want to bring to your attention. Because the feedback loop is specific, right? And it is iterative and it flows both ways. All of that really ladders up to this idea that it's actionable. And so when feedback loops are designed well, they do three powerful things. The first is that they prioritize community perspective. It ensures that people feel seen, heard, and valued, that their perspectives are prioritized. The second thing that it does is that it creates real influence. And so stakeholders know that their voice can change teaching and learning ecosystem, that they're not just being acknowledged or what we mentioned earlier, just done out of compliance. And then lastly, it helps to ensure transparency. So it's clear what happens to feedback after it's shared and how it's acted on. So in short, feedback loops can be the difference between a community that feels ignored and one that really feels like they're walking alongside you, identifying solutions to the problems and challenges that they've named. So powerful feedback loops look like this: tailored solutions, connected to research and practice, and amplifying voices. And when I say voices, I mean educators and students. In our third webinar, we're going to talk about third and final webinar. We're going to talk about student voice and the value of having students at the table. But it's going to do those three things. It's going to be tailored to solutions. It's going to be connected to research and practice, and it's going to amplify student voices. And what this looks like for districts is that when they see that the feedback that you're gathering is done thoughtfully, it makes a difference, right? Especially as stakeholders we talked about skin in the game earlier, they've made an investment in your tool or your product. They want to know that what they're contributing is being handled thoughtfully. Also, analyzing the data and identifying any gaps. That's really important for them because, anybody can have a product, have a tool, but when you are able to make connections between solving a problem that the district has named and you allow them to analyze data with you and identify gaps, that makes it really rich for the districts. And then offering customized solutions to fill those gaps is significant as well. And then finally, again, that loop, evaluating and iterating on that. So you're building a loop and not just a line, right? It's not a transactional experience that you have with the district, but it is a relational one. And we talked about that being one of the priorities, that relationship building. Now, I do want to name before we go too far, because there is a difference between traditional feedback loops and feedback loops designed through the mechanism of co-design. And so when you're closing the loops, that positions families and educators as experts in their own experience. And so take a look on the screen. On the left-hand side is the traditional feedback where maybe you collect input from families and then you analyze it and then you implement it and then you inform the families of the changes. Maybe it is families provide that feedback, but they weren't involved in interpreting the data. They weren't involved in solving or sourcing solutions. Or it could look like creating a pattern where families remain just data sources rather than thought partners, right? I talked earlier about how we do work with communities and not for them. Now, on the right-hand side is what feedback loops look like with co-design at the center. So now this is when you still collect input from those families or those stakeholders. However, you return to those same families or same stakeholders, and you now have synthesized those ideas or themes, and then you work together to co-design a solution. It could also look like families who identify challenges, they become partners in designing responses to those challenges. And then lastly, it really elevates building capacity and ownership because solution creators are also solution users. So I mentioned earlier about proximity. Those who are closest to the challenge or problem have a voice at the table in providing ideas around the solution. So I want us now to just look at the three components of a feedback loop because in a moment, we're going to see what this looks like in real time in a case study. The first is gathering feedback. Now, this could happen several different ways through surveys, listening tours, focus groups, informal check-ins, right? But you really want to just make sure you're gathering feedback from your community stakeholders. The second component is analyzing and interpreting that feedback. So maybe you're disaggregating that data, you're contextualizing that data, you're sense checking or seeing themes or patterns across the data. And then you respond, right? So you don't just collect it and then analyze it, put it on the shelf, but you respond to the data and you do so publicly and visibly. And so, again, that part is closing the loop. And oftentimes, if people don't see that the loop has been closed, then their feedback disappears. Potentially, they just stop engaging altogether. And so here's what a feedback loop can look like within the ecosystem of education. It works the exact same way. What you're looking at here is that ecosystem where the feedback loop operates within the providers, the schools, the educators, the students, the families, all of these in relationship with one another. And so the first arrow shows how information is going from the entrepreneur or edtech developer to the district, right? These are maybe the decision makers. And then it goes from the district, or I'm sorry, it goes from a dashed or dotted line, goes from the ed tech developer entrepreneur to the educator. And this is a dashed or dotted line because we talked about feedback loops being cyclical and iterative. Maybe not at every milestone you're engaging the educator because you have other components that are a part of your roadmap, but you are maintaining regular engagement to get their feedback on how your tool is being implemented in the teaching and learning practice. And then we see here two arrows where the first is going from the student and family to the district. So they're sharing back their experience with a tool. And then the district is sharing information with the family and student. And so we see that that is bi-directional, going both ways. And the same is true from the educator to the student and the families. It's going to be bi-directional where they're getting and giving feedback to one another. And then lastly, on our last two components of feedback, we see that it goes from the educator to the district and then from the entrepreneur or ed tech developer to the student and family. And again, this is a dashed or dotted line because while you regularly have touch points with them according to your feedback cadence, it may not happen at every single point in your roadmap milestone. And so this is the picture of an education feedback loop. And so now let's take some time to do a deep dive in one company who used feedback loops to go from good to great. Now, I told you that it was going to be appetizing, and I was not playing with you. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Doritos Locos Tacos. And if you've not had one, I encourage you to stop by and get one. This is why looping it back matters. $1 billion idea that was almost just an idea. I want to share something with you. about this particular case study. In 2012, Taco Bell launched the Doritos Locos Tacos, and it went on to generate over $1 billion in sales in its first year. It became one of the most successful fast food product launches in history. But here's what most people don't know. The idea had already been sitting around internally for years. Someone had sketched it out. It was just one concept among dozens, and it stayed a sketch because nobody had a structured way, feedback loop, to validate it. They didn't have a way to test it with real people and act on what they learned. But we had that, they had the idea, but it just wasn't enough. And what turned into $1 billion product really happened because of a feedback loop. Let me walk you through what that looked like for this company. The framework around collect, reflect, respond, and return is how we are going to frame this up, okay? So before I dive into the details of the Taco Bell case study, I want us to focus our attention on this four-step cycle because we're going to see how it showed up for Taco Bell. Now, the first is collect. When you think about collect, that's pretty intuitive. You're gathering feedback, you're gathering input from the stakeholders, the ones that you identified, maybe that there's a gap and you want to hear more from them. So you're taking the time to do that again through focus groups, surveys, really informal measures. But however you choose to do it, you're getting feedback from your community stakeholder group. The second phase of this is reflect. So this is after you've received the feedback, you want to make sense of it. Where are there patterns? Where are you seeing maybe trends across certain groups? You want to take the time to do this because you may see some stories emerge that maybe you hadn't seen or noticed before. The third thing that you want to do is you want to respond. Remember, we talked about feedback loops. After you have received the feedback, you want to act on it because those that you are gathering the input from want to be seen, valued, and heard, and doing that in a very intentional way. And this could look like maybe very significant shifts in your product or your tool, or it could look like incremental shifts, maybe smaller changes. But either way, you want to respond back to the group. And then the last phase of your feedback loop cycle is return. So this is where we're talking about closing the loop. You want to tell that community what you heard, what you were able to implement, and the things that you were not able to make shifts on, being transparent about why or why not. And so in the Taco Bell case study, here is what collect, reflect, respond, and return looked like. All right. So in the collect phase, and let me make sure we don't have any questions in the chat. Okay. In the collect phase, you're going directly to the stakeholders. You're using the channel that best fits them. We talked about that earlier. And for Taco Bell, the question before investing in the serious R&D was simple. Is the appetite really there? Not do people think Doritos Locos Tacos is interesting in theory, but do they really want to eat a Dorito slash taco? The demand signal it wasn't just one clean piece of input. It was scattered for years. Remember, I said 2012, they had this idea on the shelf for a long time. The concept was just one of about 30 ideas that floated around on their product team with no clear owner, to the point where the company later had trouble crediting really anyone specific. But the real lever for actually collecting and acting on it came when their CEO issued this brief instructing the team to reinvent the taco, which in that moment, scattered input, it turned into actionable work. And that's how the feedback loop started. They started gathering input from those who seemed like they had a level of interest. And a quote from a member of the team said this: "In research groups, consumers often said they liked putting potato chips in their sandwich. Others said they loved the flavor of Doritos." Now, that's a piece of feedback, whether we like it or not. That's a piece of feedback. And so they found that valuable and it helped to inform the design of the solution. So let's take a look at step two. Reflect. Now, this is really important because this is the part where you make sense of what it is that you heard. So, not just cataloging responses, but making connections across them. So, maybe where do groups agree? Where are the tensions? Is there a pattern that I'm seeing versus just a one-off comment? And how this showed up for Taco Bell is that this was the step that let them move from some people said they like Doritos to there is a clear, consistent appetite for this flavor profile. And that's the kind of insight that is directional, that is targeted, and it's not just a data point. And so before investing in that R&D again, they wanted to reflect and make sense of that data. And so if we apply that to the education ecosystem, this is a step where you sit maybe with students, sit with what the educator said alongside with what community members said, and see where the picture becomes clearer or sometimes more complicated. And I want you to remember that the goal isn't consensus, but it is understanding. The third step is responding. And this is where you're making real shifts in the product, in the practice of the program. This is the step that proves the input that they shared mattered. For Taco Bell, this wasn't about tweaking a marketing message. It was really about building a new product. This is where most of the actual work happened, right? So for people who maybe they remember using the spray gun anecdote where the food scientists, they spent years in the test kitchens trying to engineer what this would look like, how to stabilize it, how to add the flavored Dorito dust on there. All of these iterations in order to respond back to the community who had the appetite for this. And so this is literally you're building based on what it is that you learn. You're translating that data, you're validating the demand that your community has. And so if we again apply this to the education edtech ecosystem, responding might look like changing an onboarding flow because teachers told you they felt overwhelmed in the first 2 weeks. It might mean even adding a feature that surfaced from a student co-design session. It might mean retiring something you built that turns out nobody's actually using it the way the design team imagined it. But the point is that something changes. You don't get a thank you email, but an actual product or practice shift that traces back to what your community said shows up. And then last step is return, and that's closing the loop visibly. This is being transparent with your community about what changed and why. And this step is not optional. It's really what makes the round of input feel worth giving. In the case of Taco Bell, they closed the loop publicly with the national launch in March 2012, leaning into the idea that it wasn't just a fan-driven creation, it wasn't just a top-down corporate invention, but it really became a co-designed product. The idea started with internally Taco Bell team, and they used feedback loops to make it make sense. And we can see how the collect, reflect, respond, return cycle happened over time. And so I'll leave this with you as we get ready to close in just a few moments. The idea didn't come from the community, but they are the ones who refined the idea. They are the ones who tested the idea. And so, three things that I would encourage you to keep priority when we talk about feedback loops. The first is testing with real customers, right? I mentioned that there were well over 30 recipes that were tested. But it was done so with people who had an appetite, with people who acknowledged that there was a problem. I like to put chips on my sandwich. how can I make this make sense in terms of a flavor profile and a meal that I can have? And then a fan joins the campaign. Sometimes there's an outlier comment or an outlier piece of input that kind of lets the light bell or the light bulb go off in your mind. And we have to be open to those things because that's a part of the iterative process. And then the community kept talking after the launch. Sometimes, even after you close the loop, you continue to re-engage. One, to maintain that relationship, but also because over time, when you iterate on something, you see gaps and you find opportunities to improve something even better. And so, again, Taco Bell sat on this product for years, not because they just did, but because nobody had a structured way to validate and act on it. And so that is the purpose of a feedback loop. It is in service to the edtech developer and entrepreneur in collaboration with the stakeholder groups who are closest to the challenge. And so on screen, just a few things to think about. When you think about the people who use your solution, who's giving you feedback right now and who's missing? And this was the question that I wanted to pose to the group today because earlier when you responded to the poll, you indicated where most of your feedback is coming from right now. And then you responded to what you felt like when you were asked to give feedback. And this is the marriage of both of those. As you look at who's giving you feedback right now, is there a group missing? Am I missing student voice? Am I missing maybe an increase in educator voice? Am I missing voices from district leadership indirectly? Maybe they have oversight over implementation or oversight over the technology and curriculum integration process. Who's missing from the room right now? The second thing I want you to think about is how you can maybe fill in gaps. So this is broken down by generic components of a launch, a pre-launch, early implementation, mid-implementation, and then mature. So if you're in the pre-launch stages, you're still building, and so maybe you've not identified or sourced who even needs to be at the table yet. Something to think about. If you're at the early implementation stage, maybe you're doing pilots or an early adopter in schools, have you engaged the right educators? If you're mid-implementation, you've deployed your tool, but still actively iterating, you're getting feedback maybe from educators. Have you considered or are you already getting feedback from students? And then if you're a mature entrepreneur, ed tech developer, you're established, but looking to deepen partnerships or expand, how have you considered evolving your feedback loops so there are others at the table? Think about the last 90 days of feedback you've collected. What's one group you haven't heard from that you probably should have? Just something to think about. So let's come back to this four-step framework and make it actionable for you today. Collect. The question here is, are you going to the right people? Are you using the right method? We mentioned the short surveys, a structured conversation, maybe even engaging students. So it's the channel. You want to use the right channel to fit the right community. For reflect, most organizations skip this step, or sometimes they move through it with a really, really fast pace. But you want to pause here. You're collecting that feedback, but you don't want to go straight to building. You really do want to reflect to find the right signal where you notice maybe three different groups said something slightly different about the same problem. That's attention that you want to lean into. And then for respond, the hardest part about respond is not knowing what to change, is being willing to make the shift, maybe when feedback points somewhere uncomfortable. And so if your community tells you that a core feature isn't working, the loop, that feedback loop, looping it back requires you to take it seriously, even sometimes if it's costly. And then the last is return. Most feedback processes don't always make it here because maybe you changed something based on what you heard, but you want to go back and tell the people who told you, right? You want to do that in the same way that you gather the feedback from them. And so being mindful of saying, you told us X, and here's what we did to act on it or not, and here's why. And one thing I do want to flag though is that return doesn't require that you do every single thing that the community asks. I do want to name that because sometimes feedback surfaces attention you can't solve right now, but transparency about that is still extremely valuable. So even saying you told us this matters to you, we're not there yet. Here's why, and when we can expect to revisit it. That is still closing the loop. That is still looping it back, treating your community like the co-design partners that they are. And so I want to pause here if there are any questions. I do, looks like we have a few. Oh, I think I accidentally turned my camera off. Okay, all right. Looks like we have about three questions, and I want to make sure we get to these. Time, we're good on time. Okay. The first question says, how do you decide which feedback should influence product or program decisions? Okay, that's a good question. I think I briefly hit on it a little bit in that closing part about reflect, respond, and return. So, the decision-making point is really what matters. How do you decide which feedback should influence product or program decisions? There are a lot of indicators around that, right? Obviously, the first one is always high on the priority. I shouldn't say always, high on the priority list budget. Is this going to impact us significantly financially? That's a transparent conversation that you have to make because if you've spent X number of time, your UX team has already designed a feature or has already designed a tool, and then you do feedback on the end and find out that this maybe is not what they need or what they want or what works for them, then that's a real conversation that you have to have. The second thing that I would say is we talked about earlier that your solution or your tool helps to meet the needs of the district. Does that feedback map back to improving or addressing the needs of the district? That's something that you want to take highly into consideration. And then you also, of course, want to look at timeline. Districts are on different timelines, right? And so are ed tech and entrepreneur teams. And so you want to align your schedules, your timeline, your user experience or user testing. It has to make sense for everyone in terms of the order of operations. And so there are several different components that you have to look at in order to decide what features you or what feedback you act on. And sometimes you have to prioritize even in that. So maybe you say, we can act on all three, but what makes the most sense to do urgently, maybe not as urgent. So prioritizing would be really important as well. I hope that was helpful. And if you need more clarity, please feel free to drop that in chat. Do you have any resources for how to get reliable feedback surveys or so? And you ask the questions has such an impact. I love to educate myself about how to make the feedback I seek. Yes. Oh my goodness. Okay, so that's wonderful. Let's do this. Yes, to answer your question. I am going to send you an email with some information. I would love to share that with you. And also, I'm happy to connect, 30-minute coffee chat to talk more about that. But you are exactly right. You want to get to the right answers and ask the right questions. So I will be happy to share that with you, Danny. Let's see. Okay, I answered that. Can you share an example of a time when stakeholder feedback led to a significant change for an edtech solution? Yes. Oh, that's a good question. Okay, the first one that comes to mind, I'll just share one for the sake of time. There was a edtech tool that was in schools. This was on the West Coast, and they were in a pretty large district. And this district at the time had over, I believe, 40 languages that they spoke. And this was an app that the district used to push out messages to the parents and the students. Well, they were doing their regular feedback loop, trying to understand like if the app was, if they were finding utility with the app, if the features that they were pushing out were helpful for both the district and the families. And some of the feedback they heard was that while it did meet some of the higher priority languages that were in the district, it did not meet all of them. And so that team took that feedback very seriously because they're pushing out messages about free lunch available and community center operations happening and things that families and students really valued. So I think they spent, I think it was 3 or 4 months really going back to the table and trying to figure out how they can integrate multi-language use into their app, into their platform. And they were able to do just that. They were able to meet the needs of the district because the district said, hey, the tool is great. We love it. We're getting the messaging out, but we're not able to do so with all of our families. And so that was based off of feedback that the district and the families shared with that developer. And I was really, really pleased when I heard that they improved their tool. But not only that, the district had, they were glowing because they felt more connected to their full student community, student and family community. So that's an example of feedback mattering. And I would say this as well. They did communicate to the families that it's in process. We're working on it, right? So they didn't get the feedback, go silent, and then pop out with the new feature. They did early on share that information back to the families to say, we heard you. It can't happen right now, but it's coming. Let's see. Did I answer all the questions? How can organizations demonstrate that stakeholder feedback is being used rather than simply collected? So that goes back to sharing it back out visibly, right? So sometimes, I'll just use this as an example. Sometimes a press release works, right? But sometimes it doesn't. Because is that getting to our families? Is that the right channel to get to the community that we're serving? And so we always want to prioritize the community that we're doing the work in service of, and sharing it back out, closing the loop really matters. And so I would say that you always want to prioritize the best mechanism or channel to reach your educators, your students, and the families that you serve. Who should we start with when trying feedback loops for the first time? Well, my recommendation would always be to start with your user group. And so if it is a teacher-facing tool, they're going to be your primary audience for feedback, but let me say this, you do have a secondary audience, and that is the students. And so it may be a teacher-facing tool, but the students to some degree have feel the impact of that tool as well. And then vice versa. If it's a student-facing tool, you want to get feedback from the students, and then a secondary audience would be the families as well as the educators. Okay. All right. I think we're good on time. I don't see any other questions. So if you have questions, I'm going to share my email in just a moment. I would love for you to send those my way. I would be happy to answer them for you. So let's move into our close for this afternoon. I want to first say thank you so much for your time and for just your engagement in our session today for Loop It Back. And I'll leave you just with two things. Feedback loops really help to create accountability, and they do that through transparency. So, not just reporting the outcomes, but regularly communicating how your community's input has directly shaped your decisions, or maybe change your practices or refine your tools and a feature. And structured pathways for community wisdom are very useful to influence meaningful change. And so when we talk about feedback loops or looping it back, that cyclical process is where the insights from your diverse stakeholders really show up and help to design what gets built or what gets refined. And so that's always the goal. I want to share with you just before we leave a summer cohort experience that we have designed to help ed tech developers and entrepreneurs, leaders, creators bridge solution design, real district impact, and long-term adoption. So in just a moment, we are going to drop a link if this is something that you're interested in. It is an August summer cohort, a 4-week cohort. When we open up the application, I would love to share that with you all. And here's what you can expect inside the summer school. We're going to talk about product feedback and how that shows up in the classroom. We're also going to talk about designing for those in close proximity to the challenge. So, building practices around centering local context, lived experiences, so that the solutions that are being designed or refined or shaped by those who will use them. And then we're going to talk about what it is that districts really need, building things better. It's going to be an amazing curriculum. We're really excited about that. And so if summer school is something that you're interested in, we would love to have you again. We're going to drop the link in just a moment. Oh, it's already there. I didn't even scroll down. Thank you so much for dropping that. So please fill out that interest form. We plan to open applications mid-July. And so as soon as those applications open, we will send you that information. And if you enjoyed today's session, please scan the QR code on the screen. You can register for free for our third and final session, Wednesday, July 8th. Student-led developer built a new model for edtech solution co-design. You do not want to, if you thought this was good, you do not want to miss our last webinar session. And then if you have any questions, if you have some curiosities, I am happy and would love to connect with you. You can scan the QR code or send me an email. Let's have a coffee chat. Put some time on the calendar. Let's meet and greet. I would love to think through conversation with you, ideas with you. I'm open for all of that. And so I wanted to make sure I extend that invitation to you all as well. Well, all good things must come to an end. Thank you so much for your time today, for your engagement. And I hope that you walked away with at least one thing you can take back to your team to evolve the work that you're doing. Such great work you're doing connecting with our districts, our educators, and students. And so we want to support you along the way. Hope to see you at webinar 3. And thank you so much for joining. We'll see you next time.